In the quaint wine town of Klingenberg am Main, deep in the heart of Bavaria, Anneliese Michel is born. A name that to this day raises questions and provokes controversy. She comes into a world shaped by strict Catholic faith. Her father, Josef Michel, came from a long-established family of craftsmen. A man whose life was shaped by the expectations of his deeply religious mother. 3 of his aunts were nuns, and he too was originally meant to follow the path of priesthood. But fate had other plans. After an apprenticeship as a carpenter, he was swept away to war, to the Western and Eastern fronts. When he returned from captivity in 1945, he was a changed man, marked by the horrors of war, but also by a deep, almost fanatical faith. Josef Michel's worldview was permeated by prophecies and visions. The apparitions of Fatima, the predictions of the Bavarian medium Alois Irlmeier, and the messages of the seer Barbara Weigand. All of this shaped his view of a world that increasingly seemed threatening to him. And then there was Anna, Anneliese's mother, a woman with a past that caused whispers in little Klingenberg. She brought a child into the marriage, a child whose existence was shrouded in rumors. Was it the child of a priest? Was money paid to make the marriage possible? This child, Anneliese's half-sister, died in 1956 from a kidney tumor. But even in death, it found no peace in the bosom of the family. As an illegitimate child, it was not buried in the family grave, but at the cemetery wall, a silent witness to the strict moral codes of that time. It was September 1968. Anneliese, just 16 years of age, experienced something that would change her life forever. A seizure shook her young body. Almost a year later, in August 1969, the horror repeated itself. The doctors made a devastating diagnosis: cerebral seizure disorder, epilepsy. As if fate hadn't been cruel enough to her already, Anneliese soon after fell ill with pneumonia and tuberculosis. She spent 6 months in a lung sanatorium in the Allgäu region. It is said that it was there that she first saw the grimaces, devilish faces that haunted her, and voices from hell itself speaking to her. Back at school, nothing was the same as before. Anneliese became lonely, sank into depression. Her grades plummeted, just like she herself. In her desperation, she turned to the only thing that still gave her support: her faith. She prayed incessantly, went to Mass several times a week. As penance for others, she even slept on the cold, hard floor. But the darkness within her continued to grow. Spring 1973. Anneliese heard knocking sounds from the closet, under the floor, above the ceiling. The voices became louder, clearer. They spoke of damnation, of eternal torment. The doctors spoke of paranoid psychosis. But was it really that, or had something else taken possession of Anneliese? Whatever it was, it didn't let go of her anymore. Even when she passed her high school graduation and began studying in Würzburg, the shadows followed her. The summer of 1973 marked a turning point in Anneliese Michel's life. What began as a spiritual journey would soon turn into a nightmare. During a pilgrimage to San Damiano, Anneliese suddenly showed a frightening aversion to all things holy. Crucifixes, which she once loved, now triggered screams of horror. Holy water seemed to burn on her skin like acid. The pilgrimage leader, convinced that more than just illness was at work here, urged Anneliese to present herself to a clergyman. But the first priest saw nothing unusual. However, the whispers in Anneliese's head grew louder. The shadows in the corners of her room seemed to dance. Faces formed in the darkness. Was it imagination or reality? Father Adolf Rodewig, an expert in demonology, was consulted. His books on possession were famous in Catholic circles. When he studied Anneliese's case, he immediately recognized the signs. "This is no ordinary illness," he is said to have whispered. "Something dark is at work here." From autumn 1973, Pastor Ernst Alt met regularly with Anneliese. Initially every 2 weeks, later once a month. In September 1974, Alt came to a frightening conclusion. Circumpossession, he called it. A state in which demons harass the affected person without taking full possession. For Anneliese and her desperate parents, this was a glimmer of hope. Finally an explanation for the inexplicable suffering. July 1st, 1975 marked a turning point. On this day, Ernst Alt performed the first exorcism on Anneliese, a so-called Exorcismus probativus. The reaction was shocking. Anneliese is said to have torn apart her rosary, an unthinkable act for a young woman deeply rooted in the Catholic faith. Exhausted from the seizures and weakened by weight loss, Anneliese retreated to her parents' house. Her studies had to wait. At Pastor Alt's request, Würzburg Bishop Josef Stangl agreed to another, this time minor, exorcism. It was performed on August 3rd, 1975. From this point on, Anneliese's condition deteriorated rapidly. She hardly found sleep anymore, suffered from strong urges to move, screamed and raged. While she refused any ordinary food, she turned to other things, eating beetles and insects, even drinking her own urine. Pastor Alt now pushed for admission to a mental hospital. But for Anneliese and her parents, this was out of the question. They feared for her future, her career as a teacher. They were convinced only faith could save her now. In early September, Adolf Rodewig visited Anneliese Michel. His assessment for Bishop Josef Stangl was clear. The great exorcism was necessary. This recommendation would seal the fate of the young girl. Just a few days later, on September 16th, Bishop Stangl made the momentous decision. He ordered the great exorcism according to the Rituale Romanum, a rite that is only used in the most extreme cases, when it is believed that a soul is possessed by the devil himself. Father Arnold Renz was appointed as the exorcist. 67 exorcistic sessions. 67 times Anneliese stood on the threshold between our world and another. Father Renz meticulously documented this descent into hell on tape. What the tapes revealed makes even hardened skeptics' blood run cold. Anneliese's voice, distorted and barely recognizable, repeatedly broke into blood-curdling screams. Obscenities and blasphemies poured from her mouth, words that no innocent girl would ever utter. The exorcists were convinced. Not just one demon had taken possession of Anneliese. They identified an unholy alliance of Lucifer himself and the spirits of notorious historical figures. Judas, the traitor, Nero, the mad emperor, Cain, the first murderer, and Adolf Hitler, the incarnation of evil in the 20th century. But that wasn't all. Another name emerged, less known but no less ominous. Valentin Fleischmann, a 16th century priest and murderer. Amidst this storm of torment and supernatural apparitions, a shocking truth was revealed. Anneliese was suffering from a so-called atonement possession. Her body and soul became a battlefield where she fought against the powers of hell on behalf of others. The origin of this cruel fate, a curse uttered by a former neighbor of her mother, even before Anneliese had seen the light of day. A curse that was now unfolding its full, destructive power. While the exorcisms dominated Anneliese's life, she desperately tried to maintain the appearance of normalcy. She commuted between Würzburg and Klingenberg, torn between her studies and the exorcism rituals. A tightrope walk between two worlds, only made possible by absolute secrecy. The beginning of Lent on March 3rd, 1976, marked the beginning of the end for Anneliese Michel. On this Ash Wednesday, the voices in her head didn't quiet down. No, they became louder, more commanding. "Don't eat," they ordered her, and Anneliese obeyed. Her body, already weakened by months of torment, now began to consume itself. But hunger wasn't the worst of it. Anneliese tortured herself. For hours she knelt on the hard floor until her knees were bloody and raw. Again and again she slammed her head on the floor, as if trying to drive the demons out of her skull. By mid-April, Anneliese was so weak that she could no longer leave her bed in Würzburg. But instead of seeking help, her relatives shielded her. The bishop had ordered silence, and everyone obeyed. In May, Pastor Ernst Alt brought her back to Klingenberg, to her parents' house. There, Anneliese's torment escalated immeasurably. 500, 600 knee bends a day. She lashed out, bit, scratched, hurting herself. In a fit of frenzy, she tried to bite holes in the wall. A tooth broke off, but she no longer felt any pain. In the last weeks of her life, those present tied Anneliese to the bed, not to torture her, but to protect her from herself. But in Anneliese's mind, a new, terrible delusion had formed. She believed she recognized the stigmata of Christ on herself. Her sore feet from shoes that were too tight, the bloody knees from hours of kneeling. For Anneliese, these were holy signs. On June 30th, 1976, the Exorcists performed their ritual for the last time. But it was too late. Anneliese's emaciated body had no strength left. On July 1st, 1976, Anneliese Michel's life was extinguished. At the time of her death, the 5'5" tall young woman weighed only 68 pounds, starved, exhausted, with pneumonia. On the very day of her passing, the Aschaffenburg Public Prosecutor's Office opened an investigation. It was Father Ernst Alt himself who alerted the authorities. A young woman has died. She had been exorcised for months. The prosecutors acted swiftly. On the same day, Anneliese's body was subjected to an autopsy. The criminal police expanded their investigation. The suspicion: negligent homicide. In the investigators' sights, Anneliese's parents, Father Alt, Father Renz, Stangl, and Rodewig. But soon, the prosecutor's office dropped the proceedings against Stangl and Rodewig. The reason? They had no real contact with the victim. But was that the whole truth? The questions piled up, and the answers remained in the dark. Then, on February 25th, 1978, months after Anneliese's death, the case took another turn. Her grave was to be opened. Officially, it was said that the body was only to be transferred to a new coffin, but rumors circulated. A lay sister claimed that Anneliese had appeared to her. Her body, she whispered, it is uncorrupted. Was this to be the final proof of the supernatural? In the dim mortuary, the witnesses gathered. The mayor, undertakers, police officers, all had come to witness this eerie moment. But curiously, the main actors of the drama were missing. Father Renz, it was later said, had been prevented from entering. Other witnesses disagreed. The moment of truth had come. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the lid of the coffin was raised. Those present held their breath. What would they see? A miracle, an uncorrupted body that defied all laws of nature. When the lid was fully opened, the supernatural tension gave way to a cruel reality. What the witnesses saw corresponded to natural decomposition. No miracle, no divine intervention. Only the hard, unrelenting truth of death. The Aschaffenburg exorcism trial drew the attention of international media. Even the Vatican followed the proceedings with eagle eyes. In the dock, Anneliese Michel's parents and the two exorcists, Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt. The charge: negligent homicide by omission. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense to the breaking point. Experts were questioned, assessments were made. The cruel truth came to light. Her death could have been prevented through timely medical help, through medication, through forced feeding. But the accused lived in their own world, a world where the devil was real, where only divine help could bring salvation. The experts spoke of naive, even primitive religious convictions. One of the priests was even diagnosed with a possible psychosis. The parents' defense was shocking in its simplicity. They had entrusted their daughter's fate to the church. The priests pushed the responsibility back onto the parents. A vicious circle of blame. On April 21st, 1978, the verdict was delivered. All four were sentenced to 6-month prison terms, suspended for 3 years, on probation. The court saw reduced criminal responsibility due to the unshakable belief in the existence of the devil. The defendants initially appealed, but then withdrew their appeals. For them, the true judgment was God's business. The worldly courts, in their conviction, had no jurisdiction. The case of Anneliese Michel, a mystery that raises questions to this day and divides opinions. What really happened to the young woman from Klingenberg? Epilepsy, followed by a severe psychogenic psychosis. This is the sober diagnosis of the doctors. But can that explain everything? The supernatural phenomena that many witnesses claim to have seen. Psychologists see Anneliese's fate as the result of a strict Catholic upbringing, an outbreak of suppressed aggression, disguised as possession. Some experts claim, as a possessed person, Anneliese could insult everything Catholic without fear of punishment. Was it perhaps a desperate cry for freedom? Particularly interesting, the statements made during the exorcisms. Were they really messages from another world, or were they put into Anneliese's mouth to pursue church political goals? The aftermath of the case is still felt today. A young woman, just 23 years old, died an agonizing death. Not by the hand of a demon, but by the hands of those who claimed to help her. Anneliese suffered. She suffered from epilepsy, from psychological problems, from the expectations that her strictly Catholic environment placed on her. Her torments were not alleviated, but intensified. Medications were discontinued, medical help was refused. The tragedy of this case lies not only in Anneliese's death, it lies in the delusion of all those who should have known better. Priests who placed medieval practices above modern knowledge. Parents who, in their religious zeal, lost sight of their child's well-being. This case warns us to be vigilant. Vigilant against false prophets who promise simple answers to complex questions. Vigilant against those who condemn science in the name of faith. It must be both a warning and a mission to us. Never again must we allow ignorance and fanaticism to triumph over compassion and medical reason. Anneliese Michel, may she rest in peace, and may her fate remind us all that the true demon often lurks not in the possessed, but in the possession itself. The possession of ideas that harm people more than they help.